Hi, everybody. Let's get this party started, shall we? Our speaker today joins us from our neighbor institution, Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, where she is and has been the Lance Corporal Benjamin W. Schmidt, Professor of War, Conflict, and Society in 20th Century America since 2015. She got her PhD from Indiana University, a Big Ten institution. According to her website, she researches and writes about the ways 20th century wars have shaped and been shaped by American society and culture. She has written multiple articles, chapters, and 3 entire books, including Officer, Nurse, Woman, the Army Nurse Corps in the Vietnam War, and The Girls Next Door, Bringing the Home Front to the Front Lines. Today, she will be talking to us about Good Girls Gone to War, entertaining the American military in World War II. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Kara Dixon Vuic.
Good afternoon. How's the pizza? Good? Good. Can everybody do the Go Frogs? Is that too close? Sorry. Okay, never mind. All right. Thank you all for having me today. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to talk about women in Women's History Month and in all months, just as a plug. But what I would like to do first, there we go. Okay, now we're back on. I want to tell you about Benjamin Schmidt. So Karen mentioned that I'm the Benjamin Schmidt Professor at TCU. Benjamin was a San Antonio native. He came to TCU for 3 semesters came in the fall of 2008. And Benjamin had a really good time, a real good time. And after about 3 semesters, his family decided he was, in fact, having too much fun. And they said, you know, we're not going to fund this little adventure you're having up in Fort Worth. And so Benjamin went home and he joined the Marine Corps. He became a scout sniper. He had several deployments, once on a ship. He went to Afghanistan once, came home. And he was looking at the end of his 4-year enlistment and was making plans to come back to TCU. Benjamin loved military history, and he wanted to teach military history, go on and get a PhD, and become a professor. But before he could do that, he learned that the battalion was being ordered to Afghanistan again. And Benjamin, because his enlistment was set to end, he did not get orders to go, but he knew that none of his fellow scout snipers had been in combat before, and he said somebody needs to go with them who's been before. And so he actually lied to his family, told them he had to go, but he volunteered to go with them. And on October 6, 2011, he was killed in a friendly fire accident in Helmand Province in Afghanistan. And when that happened, the history department at TCU got a phone call. And they said this knucklehead boy, who had a really good time and didn't go to class very often, left half of his life insurance policy to the history department to fund a graduate student fellowship because he said he didn't want to fund knuckleheads like himself. He wanted to fund a graduate student to give them a year to write their dissertation. And so that unfathomable act of generosity began a whole legacy on our campus that Benjamin started. His parents, his family and friends created a professorship on the campus, which is the position I have. We get to do big symposiums on war, conflict, and society, and it's all because of that kid, 24-year-old kid who loved history. One of the things we try to do at one of our symposia, his dad stood up at the end of an amazing talk given by a historian, and he said, "I know the cost of war." And so that's what we try to do. Right, we try to talk about the cost of war, and that's what I hope to do today, but maybe through a different angle than we sometimes think of. As Karen mentioned, my work is on women in the military, and what I'm going to talk about today comes from this book, which is about American women who have entertained the U.S. military, starting in World War I and actually going through the wars in Afghanistan. So about a 100-year history, and we'll talk about World War II. which is, it's one of those moments in history that a lot of people know lots about, right? People talk about World War II all the time. And when they talk about women, what I think most people tend to think of is either women in the military, right? Women who joined the armed forces during war, or women who worked in factories on the home front, women who went into war industry. And all of those changes were very profound. Sometimes I think we can forget how profound it was for women to do those things during World War II. Joining the military or going to work in industry was a big opportunity for a lot of women, right? To do things that they had not been permitted or encouraged to do before. It was a chance to see the world, right? If you join the military, it's a chance to get equal pay for equal work in factory jobs. There were lots of opportunities, but a lot of American society wasn't quite ready for those opportunities and those changes just yet. And so when we think about all of the advertising and the images of women from World War II, this is one of my favorites because I'm quite convinced, though I've never been a riveter in my life, I'm quite convinced that's not what you look like on the job. But you can see like all of the images that she's so made up and she's so like overly beautiful and feminized and all of those things, the makeup, the hair. I guarantee her fingernails are painted if she could take her gloves off and see, right? All of that is an attempt to say to the American public, yes, we know all these women are doing these unordinary things, but it will be okay, right? I mean, we think about, the advertisements of women in the military, right? These are the most pristine women in uniform I have ever seen, right? All of these images are trying to sort of assure the public this will all be fine. We know this is a radical change, it will be fine. But what I worked on were women who don't really fit into either of those camps, right? These are not women who joined the military, they're not women who stayed home. These are women who work for organizations like the Red Cross, like the USO, who go to war to entertain soldiers, right? They are literally the sideshow to war. These are women whose job it is to serve donuts, to put on dances and parties for GIs in the middle of war zones, to entertain with song and dance and all of those things. And in many ways, it is a bizarre thing to wrap your head around, right? We are sending women to serve donuts in war zones. That's kind of nuts. And so what I am trying to ask is to think about what war cost these women, right? What did it cost them to do this work? What was that work like? How did they feel about it? All of those sorts of things. So that's what we're going to try to do today. I'm going to try to juggle two microphones here so I don't, we don't have really high-pitched squeals here in a second. But what I want to start with is a little clip of a video from a Bob Hope tour. And many people in this room who will not be pointed out probably remember what Bob Hope tours are, and many people do not. Bob Hope was an entertainer who did a lot of tours for the U.S. military starting in World War II and then continued through the rest of his career. And this is a clip of him introducing a young woman who has just joined the tour, Patty Thomas. She was very young, she was a dancer, and this was at the beginning of a tour of the South Pacific in 1944. They did 150 shows in 3 months. And so I want to show you the clip, and then we'll talk about it. There's Patty Thomas. How many of you even know who Bob Hope is? A student asked me one time, who is Bob Hope? And it was like horrifying because I'm like, how do you explain Bob Hope? Like he's just everywhere and everything, but like, and there's not like a modern equivalent, but he's like, you're like a comedian that everybody knows and like, okay.
Hope displays another member of his company, Patty Thomas, a welcome sight on any battlefront.
I just want you boys to see what you're fighting for, that's all. Patty, we're going to do a little scene for you now, ladies and gentlemen. You might enjoy it. It's a little scene that's set in Central Park. Shows a boy and a girl walking through the park. I play the part of the boy. Well, some night.
Some night.
Some park.
Some park.
Some moon.
Some moon.
Some bench.
Some bench.
Some grass.
Some grass.
Some dew.
I don't.
Okay, so that's the joke, is that she says, when he says some do, she says, I don't. Okay? While they're catcalling and whistling on the stage, right? I want you boys to see what you're fighting for, right? Why does he say that? What does that mean, right? Isn't this war about what's going on in Europe? Isn't this about German aggression? Isn't this about Japanese expansion in the Pacific, right? He says, I want you to see what you're fighting for, and it's this little girl on the stage tap dancing, right? So why does he say that? I mean, few Americans could explain with any depth what the war was about, and so the U.S. government spent a lot of energy explaining to Americans what the war was about. You've all probably seen these posters of the four freedoms: freedom from want, freedom from fear, right? These are all an effort of the government to say, here is what you are fighting for. This is what the war is about, right? And part of what the war is about for American people is women. And part of that is protecting women, and you'll see a lot of these kinds of advertisements, very racist advertisements, to be real clear, depicting Japanese aggression as attacks on women, right? You have to go and protect your women because of these awful things, right? And these images are horrid, and they're also everywhere in the press at the time, right? They're everywhere, all over the place in the American public. They also depict women as the reward for war, right? As something that women should aspire to be. Sort of women should aspire to be the rewards of war. I mean, this is a Palmolive soap advertisement of all things. That's a bar of soap in the bottom, right? And what's funny to me about it is that she's saying here, I pledge myself to guard every bit of beauty that he cherishes in me, and yet there are 3 men at the top she's apparently preserving her beauty for. So it's a little tongue-in-cheek that, right, she has all of these boyfriends, apparently, that she's supposed to be very beautiful for. But this is the kind of advertisement you would see in women's magazines, in popular, Saturday Evening Post, Life magazine, all of these kinds of places. They're everywhere. So women are the reward. Women are what you come home to at the end of the war. And you'll see, I mean, all of these are advertisements for consumer goods, right? This is a silverware company advertising community silverware. And the idea is that he's going to come home from the war completely unscathed, right? He's going to come home, everything will be perfectly fine because his beautiful young woman with very red fingernails is waiting for him, right? And so if you think of the most historical, like oldest images of women as the bounty of war or as the reward for war in other ways, all of this kind of plays into it. It's very much tied up with capitalism and sort of with rising expectations on the part of the American public. But it's also about sex, right? Even in the 1940s, it is very much about sex. And to varying degrees. You're not going to be able to hear this song, which is unfortunate because it's very cheesy bad. But this comes from a film, another cheesy film about some Marines stationed in Iceland. I'm just going to try to stop the music. And the local Marine, oh, brother. What is happening? Hang on. In the film, the Marines land in Iceland and steal away all of the local women. It's super cheesy. It involves ice skating somehow. I'm not quite sure. But the premise of the song, listen, little lady, it's the order of the day issued by the highest of authority. Fellows in the service simply can't be turned away. you know that defense, but get priority. So if you're patriotically inclined, heed the call, right? I mean, the impetus is make the boys happy, right? I love your facial expressions right now, by the way, because like that is the response today. And to be real clear, what they are not saying in the song is do everything the boys want to do, right? But get to that line. Right? I mean, this makes the skin, like the hair on my arms stand up right now. I'm like, this is horrible. Like, think of all of the many, many ways this could be read. Your facial expression, perfect. So it is not saying that, but you can imagine hearing this as a young girl and thinking, I'm not quite sure what they are telling me to do, right? How far am I to go, right? What is the expectation, right? If you combine that with all of the official and unofficial ways that women's bodies are used as morale-boosting things, as entertainment, as all of these things, it's a pretty complicated picture, right? Yank magazine is an official Army magazine with pinups in them, and that continued through the late 60s, early 70s. Betty Grable, pinup. And I love the picture on the side because this instructor has sort of put her picture here to teach flyers how to read maps and do coordinates. And so you're using her body to teach like how to target things. I mean, everybody's seen pinups on planes, right? This is official government property, right? Where did the paint come from? Or whose plane? It's not your plane. Right? Who had the time to do it? Who gave you permission to do it? I mean, there are lots and lots of questions about what gets put on planes, and that one's pretty tame. There are others that are more explicit, right? But sort of, I mean, these are not just like guys taking pictures of girls from home with them, right? This is an official, top-down government-issued pinup. In addition to this kind of thing, and this is typically how the government wanted to portray GIs, right? That he's sort of lying in his very well-made bed. I'm pretty sure that's also not what most barracks look like in war zones, but anyway, he's lying there like wistfully looking up at these very nicely, very properly attired women, right? Race plays a big role in this picture, and in why African American press would never have depicted him looking at scantily clad women, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But this is kind of the image that Americans wanted, was that our boys, they just like girls, and they just want to get back to the girls, and all the girls are cute, and it's going to be fine, right? It'll all be fine. But what about the women? What about those women? What about Patty Thomas, who is up on a stage with guys whistling at her, and Bob Hope saying this is what the war is about? What is that? What is it like for her, right? What does it cost her to do that? And I think Patty Thomas was pretty naive when she started the work. She said later about one of her performances that when she first came out on stage, she was worried that the men wouldn't be able to hear the taps on her shoes. And I'm like, oh, bless your heart. She says that she quickly realized none of them were here to see her tap dance, right? She said, I thought everyone loved tap dancing, but that's not exactly what it was. It's a kid that's 21 years old. She has a 34-24 figure and long legs, and that's not exactly what they were there to do, to hear my taps, right? And imagine being 21 years old in a war zone and realizing that. And what do you do with that? How do you manage that? How do you continue to do your job? And if I asked anybody who knew anything about women in entertainment and war, they would probably say someone like Marlene Dietrich, who was a famous actress. She kind of steals the headlines, right? It's the famous people that a lot of folks know anything about, the Andrews sisters, it's those kinds of women. But what is vastly more common are just ordinary people, right, who join the USO, who volunteer for the Red Cross because they genuinely want to do something for the war effort, right? They want to do something that they feel they can contribute, and they are ordinary people from places like Fort Worth, Texas, and all over the planet, right? the vast majority of women are these women. They're young, they're just typically in their 20s. For most of them, it's the first time they've been anywhere far away from home, and they really want to do something. A lot of these women, and we'll talk about a few of them, a lot of these women really wanted to be in the war, right? Doing something on the home front, like going to the local USO club, that wasn't enough for them. Even women who joined the military were not guaranteed that they could go overseas. Very few of them did. The only guaranteed organization that could get you to the war, to a war zone, was the Red Cross, ironically enough. And so a lot of these women really wanted to be there. They wanted to be in it. They wanted to be doing something directly in the war. And so that's who I want to talk about today. Red Cross women typically, USO women are on stage like Patty Thomas. They're going around on tours. They're singing, they're dancing, they're doing that kind of thing. Red Cross women are typically in clubs, on bases, or in cities, and they would, it would be like if we had this room and this were a Red Cross club, there would be food, there would be drinks, there'd be music, you could get newspapers from home, you could just hang out and relax. But for troops who could not get back to base, right, who are out in the field, the Red Cross took buses and military vehicles and converted them and made what they called clubmobiles. Some of these, my favorites are the double-decker London buses that they took all of the seats out. They put donut machines in them. They had phonograph machines, all of this. And the women would drive them around and go out into the field and essentially take the fun to the front, right? Take this out to get to guys who couldn't get back. Again, going back to the facial expression of my new friend over here, to our ears today, this sounds like Crazy Train, right? Like, send girls donuts and it'll all be fine. Don't worry about it. It's gonna be fine. But some really smart, genuinely trying to do good people came up with these programs. And so what is it about? Why in the world are they doing this? And to understand it, we have to go back to World War I for a minute. During World War I, or before World War I, most Americans did not have a high view or respect of the U.S. military. Officers were one thing, but average enlisted guys were an entirely different matter. Most people thought enlisted soldiers were sort of doing the nation's dirty work. They're out there on the frontier. They're in places like Texas, sort of out of sight, out of mind, right? If they get into a bit of trouble, whatever, it's fine. Just don't cause problems, right? Don't create press in your area. It's all fine. Most people did not hope that their boys grew up to join the military, to enlist in the military. Again, officers are different. But when the U.S. entered World War I, the government passed a draft. And so now all sorts of Americans all around the country who didn't have to worry about their boys becoming, wrapped up in all the troubles of the military, now all of a sudden you do, right? Everybody's sons, in theory, are subject to being drafted, sent into the military, and get this, we're gonna send them to France, which everybody knew was this sin and debauchery and the worst place in the world, right? So not only are we gonna send them to war, where the assumption was they're gonna visit prostitutes and they're gonna get drunk, but they're gonna do it in France. So it was just all bad. And so the US government, the military, and a lot of civilian organizations said the way we're gonna counter this image is that we're gonna send women. Organizations like the YMCA, the Jewish Welfare Board, all sorts of organizations decided we are gonna send good girls from home to war zones, and they are gonna remind the boys of what home is like. They're gonna remind them you have to behave yourself, you have to walk the straight and narrow, and you have to come home and you'll be fine. And it seems very idealistic, but remember, this is the progressive era when everybody's an idealist. They're very hopeful, they're very optimistic people. And so it's a way for the government, for the military to say, we're not just gonna take your son and do all of these horrible things, expose him to all of these evils, but we're gonna make him better. right? We're going to make him a better person. He's going to come back to you better than he was when he left, right? And that's the beginning of the military sort of saying that, right? We're going to take boys and make them men. It's a way to get the public behind the draft. It's a way to comfort a lot of families worried about what's going to happen to their sons, right? And so they send thousands of women to France. They go all over the place. They serve coffee. They serve donuts. And it's a really interesting story. I mean, I love sort of these pictures. They also seem to have dogs that they've adopted in all of their group pictures. I don't know what's going on with that, but anyway, they really like to adopt random puppies in France. Now, at the end of the war, did this program keep American servicemen from visiting prostitutes and getting drunk? Absolutely not. Not by any measurable standard did it do that. But when the United States starts to look toward mobilizing for World War II, not that long after that, the very first thing that they start to say, aside from we need men to fight a war, is we need these programs back. And in World War II, their concern is a little bit less focused on morality. They've sort of given up on the idea that we're going to make them moral and we're going to convince them that they can't run around and do all of these things because it's immoral. The concern is we can't let them run around and visit prostitutes and do all of these things because that's a public health problem, right? Which is something they learned in World War I, right? You can't fight a war if you're laid up in a hospital. And so public health became a big priority in World War II. So we're going to send these women. At least we're going to give them something that we hope might motivate them, might draw them away from Paris, which is sort of a euphemism, or Piccadilly in London, right? We're going to draw them away from that. But again, it's putting women in these tenuous situations of how to do that without crossing a line, right? A big concern as well in World War II, and this came from Franklin Roosevelt down, was that he really wanted the American military to be surrounded by civilian influence. His fear, and a lot of folks' fear, was in 1941, right, December 1941, the U.S. has no idea how long this war is going to last. And if you're deployed, you are deployed for the duration of the war plus 6 months. And so a lot of the fear was we're going to send these folks away from home, away from the United States, into all sorts of foreign environments that we don't understand and we can't control. And we want to keep civilians around them so that they don't forget what home is like, so that they don't become too militarized. And again, women are a big part of that. There was I think I've gone 3 pages now, but I want to find this quote because it's a great one. It was 3 pages. Now I just got to find it. Okay, so there's an Army Air Force general. In 1945, he's at a post in Burma, and he explained that the presence of women in these faraway outposts made the difference for the servicemen between savagery and civilization. Which is a lot of pressure. I mean, there's a lot wrong with that statement too, which we could talk for days about, right? But his assumption is these women from home are going to keep us civilized, right, in all kinds of ways. So the women are there to give the men something to fight for, sort of to bolster their masculinity, but not too much, because that would be a problem, to maintain this sort of normal domestic relations so that they can easily come home and reintegrate back into civilian society. That's the hope. Again, whether it works or not is probably up for grabs, but these women give it their best. And so you can see sailors in the Philippines. This is one of my favorite photos of all of the war. It's just beautifully shot, but it shows you the extent to which they'll go just to have this contact, just to take a little bit of home to the boys at the front, even if it's on a bridge in a boat, doing the jitterbug. And I love this cartoon. I understand we'll be the first women they've seen in over a year. So we're taking the USO girls into what, according to the picture, looks like a very tropical environment. And I love to ask folks what they think of it, because it's, on one hand, the cage is to protect the women, right? But it could also be that you're caging a tiger, right? Like think zoo animals in cages, right? It could be read all kinds of different ways. And of course, it's completely not correct to say that these are the first women that troops stationed anywhere in the world have seen. They've seen all kinds of women. They just haven't seen American women. And more precisely, they have not seen white American women, right? So we're going to keep talking about race because it plays a huge role in this. Remember, the United States military is segregated at this time, right? And if you're using these women as sort of ideal women and sexual objects in a segregated military, that's introducing all sorts of concerns that U.S. officials are trying to figure out, right? What happens if, or how do we keep people separate? And for organizations like the Red Cross and the USO, both of which said, we don't segregate, which of course they do. I mean, to the extent that the Red Cross segregates blood plasma, they absolutely do segregate. And so when you add race on as another layer of what's going on here, there's a lot going on. It's very complicated. But again, all of this continues after World War II. You have women who go with the Red Cross up here in the top picture. Those women, they call them donut dollies by the time you get to Korea and Vietnam, and they're essentially the extension of what women in World War II are doing. The picture of her in her braids and her hat, like it's very 60s to me. But they continue this through Vietnam War, and after the Vietnam War, the military changes dramatically, right? The draft goes away. It's a volunteer force that we still have today, which draws in more family members, more women, and so the entertainment needs change a little bit. And so later you get things like Elmo goes on USO tour, right? Entertaining military families and kids, that kind of thing. And so it changes a lot, even though we still have the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders like parading around, and that's a whole other thing. And I'm always terrified that the state of Texas is going to revoke my driver's license when I talk about it. But the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders have traveled with USO tours for decades, and actually have also sort of changed up their program. They do kids like cheerleading camps for little girls on bases, and they do all kinds of things. But even as some of the sexual element has gone away, it's not gone away entirely, if that makes sense. And so, I mean, again, a lot of this seems like, what in the world is going on? Who thought this was a good idea? And in other ways, it seems very like mom and apple pie, right? And I wish they were eating apple pie, because I love this photograph. This is what the American public wants to see. And in part, the programs are about getting these women to these boys. They're always boys in this rendition. Get the girls to the boys so they can, have a good morale, all of these things. But it's also about the image coming home, right? It is about what we're saying to the American public that we do in war. And if you're a parent whose child is at war, you want this to be what happens in war, right? And so it is a thing that seems very strange, I think, to us today. But at the time, again, it's people with good intentions trying to do good things, even when they go awry. And it places these women in very tenuous situations, right? These women are there to boost morale, to give you something to fight for, to make you feel like you are the most important person in the world when you come into that Red Cross Club, right? Give you hope, comfort you in what is a horrid, horrid situation, right? A lot of these women are called in when troops have been in battles or have lost a lot of members. And they would bring these women in to sit with the men and comfort them, which is not something the women are trained to do. The expectation is just they'll do it because they're women and it'll be fine, but it doesn't work that way. But again, these women do their best, right? They are there with generally people of their age, trying to make them feel a tad better in a really horrid situation. And so my question is what it asks of them, right? What does it ask of these women to do in the middle of a pretty horrible situation? So I want to give you just a little bit about 3 different women. The first one is a woman named Gretchen Schuyler. I love these pictures. I can't ever cut them out because I'm like, oh, that's a good one too. So we'll start with Gretchen Schuyler, who was from Boston, and she was an accomplished athlete. She had joined the Red Cross in January 1943 and had been, her father was a World War I colonel, and so when the war started, she wanted to do something. And when she joined the Red Cross, she joined specifically the Club Mobile program, which we talked about with the buses, and they sent them all over. There were buses in India, there were buses in China, they were they were in every single theater of the war. And so Gretchen joined, and even for somebody who knew a tiny bit about war from her father's experiences, and even someone who was an athlete and very, in some ways she just seemed ready for this, right? She was ready to endure war. It was pretty difficult. She wrote her father, who she seemed to really bond with during the war. She said she was on a club mobile by 5:30 in the morning to knead by hand 120 pounds of flour, right? The donuts don't make themselves. She and a colleague then stacked and cooked donuts till 2. They served them at a camp. They came back to the post by 5. They cleaned the club mobile. They cleaned up everything, and she said she was in bed with the birds. But she said, this life agrees with me. She really liked it, even though it was tough. And after the Normandy invasion, when American troops go into France, the Red Cross assigned her to supervise a Club Mobile convoy that followed the 1st Division through France. And so she loaded up all of her group's Club Mobiles. And if you probably can't see from the back, but they have names on the back of the truck. Sometimes they're named for states. The one over here on the right is Uncle Sam. But they load them up on ships, and they land on Utah Beach about 5.5 weeks after D-Day. And they then follow the troops as they move through France and into Germany. And she drove her Jeep, which I don't know if she labeled it this or someone else did, but if you could see the full name, it's the Fetching Gretchen. Somebody named her Jeep that, and so she drove around and supervised all of the work. She did all of the ordering, sort of the managing of supplies, all of that. And she, she and the other women, they're living in the field, right? They bathe out of their helmets. They dig their own latrines. They sleep on the ground, right? They're not in hotels. These are not the buses they could have slept in if they had had those. And so they have a pretty rugged life on the road. And what's interesting to me is that for women who were enlisted as symbols of femininity and ideal womanhood, the work they are asked to do is contrasting that, right? They're not ideal femininity out here washing their hair in helmets in the middle of the field, right? But that's what the work requires. And the women really loved it. They had to drive the club mobiles. They had to change the tires. They had to change the oil. And they really loved doing that. The women who were in that program had to go and train on how to drive these trucks in convoys, right, in all sorts of conditions, and they loved it. They thought it was amazing. Like, the harder it was, they thought it was great. And they loved the fact that they wore what they called their battle dress uniform. They wore pants and jackets, sort of military style pants and jackets, which again, for women who are supposed to be there as reminders of all that is feminine and not manly, right? This puts them in positions where they're looking more like the men. And remember, like, go ask your grandmothers, but for women to wear pants in the 1940s was a thing of itself, right? Most women did not wear pants. Like, the fact that they're in pants is in and of itself a big deal. And so the women really kind of embraced this. Gretchen wrote that she and her colleagues were the least frilly of all the Red Cross women. She said, "I've never in my life been more dirty, more tired, and yet more happy." Right? They wouldn't have had it any other way. And so they really embrace kind of the harshness of their life. and their conditions as a sign that like they're really in it with the GIs, right? For them, it was a sign that they had gone to war, and they really kind of bonded with the men. She said, "This is the nearest anyone could ever be and still not be a GI." And of course, remember, if you know anything about World War II, women who were GIs were scrutinized to a great degree. But I think what Gretchen's experience shows is that the work is much more than being a pretty face, right? There's a lot involved. It's a trying kind of existence. And Gretchen's papers, for any nerdy historians in the room, are all available at the Schlesinger Library, and they're great. She has letters, and it's just amazing. Another woman who is from Florida, Hazel Bowman, she was born in Plant City, which is near Tampa, and she went to what was then called the Florida State College for Women and is now Florida State University. And she kind of became known as a little bit of a rabble-rouser when she was the editor of the student paper because she protested the 10:30 p.m. lights out rule. Gasp. Made her a bit of a rabble-rouser. After graduation, she graduated in 1937, and she went to law school, and she was one of 3 women in law school and was treated so horribly she left. She ended up teaching English and band at a high school in Florida. And then when the war started, she actually joined the Army Signal Corps, but again, could not get a guaranteed assignment to the war, and so it seems really odd that she left the Army and joined the Red Cross as a way to get to the war. And Hazel was sent to India, and you can't see anything on this map. It's so far away, and it's so detailed. And it says it's a GI view of American Red Cross, and it's a study in itself of how American GIs understood India. And it's got a lot of these women sort of bringing donuts all over the place. But Hazel was sent to India, and she was there for about 2 years. She came home in December of 45 after the war was over, and she was 26 when she went. So she's about the average age, but that's still pretty young. I mean, maybe to some of you that seems very old, but trust me, it's not. It's still very, very young for her to be doing this. And I mean, as an adventurous young woman who's really desperately trying to get to the war, she's in many ways exactly what they want, right? She's got a level head on her shoulders. She seems like she's going to be able to do this. And she gets there, and she really likes all of the attention for a little while, right? She gets there, and there aren't that many women. There aren't that many American women in the club. She probably would hate me for showing this picture because she's the one in the dead center right there, and her eyes are closed. So she would probably hate that I'm showing you that picture. Sorry, Hazel. But she and the other women really like that all of these guys are coming, and they're fawning over these women. And she writes home to her family not long after she got there. If I can find this quote on my page, I need to make the font larger. But she says that they really enjoyed it, and after a couple weeks, it got really tiring, right? It went, she said, here it is, she said at the beginning, we're so popular here that one could have dates with everything from the rank to the file and almost any service or nationality. And all of us have to pinch ourselves to remember back home it's 1 man to every 8 women. And the fellows keep insisting we have beauty, poise, et cetera, until I'm sure we'll believe it. I never figured myself for such popularity, but it's nice for a change. That lasted maybe 2 weeks. And then what she realized is that all of these men come from miles and miles away, and they're there all the time, and she's up early in the day, and she's constantly talking to these guys. I mean, she can never, ever say, hey, you've been here all day for like 4 days, and I'm kind of tired of talking to you. Can, like, we take a break? Like, she can't say that. She can't say, I'm just not into you. She can't say that, right? Like, she's got to figure out, like, how to navigate herself through this situation, still making all of these men feel very welcome and comforted and all of that, very special, but not too special, right? Because that would be bad too, and she would be sent home on the first plane, boat, whatever they get her on, right? And so a few weeks later, she writes to her family, and it's very different. She says, men can't understand why when we've seen them in the club from 11 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., we don't want to spend 9 p.m. to 1 a.m. with them also. Pretty ticklish business sometimes. And she's described her life as living in a goldfish bowl, which is a phrase that women in all of these wars use, that they can just never escape it. And so there are women who are sort of put in these situations where they're trying to manage the men's affections, men who are just guys from home and they genuinely care about, but who they also have to keep at arm's bay, right? And they have to figure out how to do that, and they have to keep them away without offending them, right? And so Hazel and her roommate decided that if they were going to socialize at all after hours, they were going to choose who they socialized with. And I think it's really interesting in terms of how women phrase what they're doing, especially to their parents in letters home. She says that most of the time men interpreted every smile as a come on and eventually tried to smooch. She said that they pick the men because even if they happen to be dull or no fun, at least they are still gentlemen, right? And you can kind of read between the lines what they're trying to do and what they're trying to avoid. But Hazel loved it. Nonetheless, despite all of that, she loved it. And she said sort of late in the war, after hearing news of the Japanese surrender, that she felt like she had learned something that very few Americans ever got the opportunity to learn. And she said that she thought she would be impatient with Americans for the rest of her life because they didn't appreciate what they had. She said if all Americans had to serve a year here, we'd never prevent another war. And it's interesting the way she really kind of took these lessons to heart. Now, the final person I'll talk to you about is Elizabeth Richardson. And she was from a little place outside of Milwaukee, and she and her friends, after graduating college, went to USO clubs on the home front, volunteered their time, but again, it wasn't enough for her. And so she joined the Red Cross and was, again, part of the Clubmobile program. And she was assigned to a Clubmobile that served the men of the 82nd Airborne who were stationed in Leicester, England, before they were sent to Germany, sort of during the invasion. And she, again, really loved her work. She wrote to her parents that what she was seeing among the men was how it affected them emotionally. She said, if you could only knew what combat does to these boys, not in the physical sense, although that's bad enough, but mentally. And she saw her job as to boost their morale and comfort and sort of help them through this awful experience. And she also knew, she realized that she was kind of a sight for sore eyes, right? She again talks about all these men kind of flocking to see her. And she wrote to her friend back home that it wasn't due to her fatal beauty that drives them mad. I'm just a victim of circumstances and non-fraternization. Basically, like, I'm the only thing here, and so they'll come find me, which is probably not true. But I think one of the things that Elizabeth shows us, too, is that these are also young women trying to make friends and maybe trying to find boyfriends, right? And Elizabeth kind of fell in love with a second lieutenant named Larry from Yonkers. And she wrote home to her parents that under better circumstances, I can imagine nothing better than burning the toast for him. It's very sweet. She was always level-headed, though, and she knew that wartime romance wasn't a good idea. And so they kind of broke it off. And in April of '45, not long after she, too, went to the continent in the Clubmobiles, she learned that Larry had been missing since the Battle of the Bulge. But in a reversal of what is the common war story, Elizabeth is the one who died. Larry made it home. Larry was found, and Elizabeth, like all Red Cross workers against the rules, hopped on little airplanes when they had to travel, and she got on a two-seater airplane one morning in July 1945 to go to Paris. There was fog, and the plane crashed and killed her instantly. She was 27 years old. And she was initially buried in a little cemetery near Évreux, France. And at the end of the war, Like all parents who had lost children or spouses who had lost a partner in the war, they had to decide, do you bring them home or leave them there? And Elizabeth's parents made what must have been an agonizing decision to leave her with the men she served. And so she is buried in the Normandy Cemetery in France. She's one of 4 women, 4 American women buried there. 72 Red Cross women died in the war, often little plane accidents like Elizabeth's. And so I think when Americans think of these women, if they do at all, it's often kind of through this nostalgic lens, right? It's this happy-go-lucky, like women going to war, we're serving donuts, they're dancing on stage. It fits with this sort of broader myth of all Americans kind of rallying together behind the troops, quite literally, sort of rallying together for the war effort, doing their part, overlooking their differences. And there are bits of truth in that version. But what we miss is what it cost these women, right? What was it like for these women to do this incredible thing? What did it cost them emotionally? How did they manage to get themselves through this? And I think, I'm going to end with a picture that you might have seen before, because I think one of the most lasting images that we have of World War II is still this notion of women as the reward, right? Women as the reward for war, women as what you get when you come home. And this picture in particular has made the news a lot lately. It's made the news many, many times. First with the Me Too movement. It's not only a photograph, it's a statue in a couple places, but it's been everywhere. And a few weeks ago, there was this whole brouhaha with the VAs, and can we show this photograph in the VAs, and can we not? And to me, the discussion is so interesting. The story is that this sailor was on leave. He was actually on a date with the woman he later married. He said he had been drinking. He had had a few drinks, he said, and when he came out, this is right after the news of the Japanese surrender was announced. It's in the middle of Times Square, and he grabbed a woman who he thought was a nurse, who was not a nurse, who was an immigrant who had lost both parents in the Holocaust. He grabbed her and he kissed her, and she said then, I didn't want to be grabbed and I didn't want to be kissed. And at the photographs, you can see he's holding her. What's interesting to me is the way in which today folks on either side of the political spectrum will say all kinds of things. What I would ask is, why is this the image we still want? Right? Why does it still hold either value for us or not? Right? It's a whole thing. But I just think it's interesting that this image still means so much to so many people, and I would ask why that is. There are lots of other images of couples who are kissing on VJ Day, both of whom are pretty into it, and right? There are lots of pictures of people kissing. These are not the only 2 Americans who kissed in August of 1945, right? Millions of people did. There are lots and lots of those pictures of people who are genuinely happy and happy to be kissing each other. But this is the one we want. And I would ask why. I don't have an answer. I have lots of thoughts, but I don't have an answer. And so it's just interesting to me. But so I would say, in our Women's History Month, think about the women who we don't always think about, right? Think about these women. As I said, all of these programs, they kind of go away after the Vietnam War. And I think in lots of ways that's a good thing, in that programs that held up women as sort of the ideal of home when they are so far away from home puts them in an awkward place. I think it positions these women as an alternative or an antithesis to war when they are actually in war. And I think it puts these women in very tenuous and dangerous situations that they have to figure out how to maneuver themselves out of. At the same time, I think women like Hazel and Elizabeth and Gretchen also showed us some really valuable lessons about humanity in war and about people who care for each other and how we might help each other through horrible situations. So with that, I would be happy to take your questions. You all have been very patient and paid very good attention while eating pizza, which is amazing. So thank you.
Okay, now if anybody has any questions, Sarah's going to come around with the microphone, so please put your hand up high and don't start asking the question until she gets there with the microphone. Okay?
Thanks for coming to talk to our school. I had read a book about female pilots during World War II, where they brought supplies to the warplanes and then fueled them, and I didn't know if you did any research on that.
Oh, so the question is about women who flew planes in World War II, and they were called WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots. They were sort of the idea of like get women in factories, free a man to fight kind of idea. I have not researched these women, but you should because they're amazing. So these are women who flew planes for the U.S. military, but they were not allowed to fly planes in combat. And so they did a lot of like ferrying planes back and forth. They also flew and pulled targets behind them so that anti-aircraft groups on the ground could shoot at the target. What could go wrong again? Yeah, these women were amazing. They trained in Sweetwater, Texas, and there's several really good books on them and a couple documentaries and a new one sort of in the works right now. But they're super amazing. Yeah. And their papers are at TW. Yes, and their papers are at Texas Women's University, just up the road. That's true, yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, are you going to talk about the women that disguise themselves as men and actually participate in the war?
Oh, in World War II, I have not heard of women in World War II disguising themselves, like in the Civil War, in the U.S. Civil War they do. Probably because women could serve in the military, and so they might not have seen a need to so much, but yeah, not that I know of. Yeah. Right behind you. Yeah.
It always intrigues me. It's not a question I have, but I was just wondering if you'd like to explain what the YMCA was, because not everyone's aware that it existed back at this time.
Great question.
And what it was today.
Yeah, no, that's great. The YMCA today is a gym, right? Or camp, yeah, exactly. So when it starts, and at least by World War I, it's partly gym. They're like, and they have some really weird exercise equipment at that time. But they're also like community centers and clubs. They're also very religiously like oriented in ways that they may not be today. But it's a way, a lot of them are in urban areas and sort of a way for people to get out of their really cramped apartments and go do something with the community. And again, the whole idea of the YMCA in general is give people something to do so they don't get in trouble. Right? I mean, summer camps for kids today, same idea, right? Like send them to the YMCA camp. Hopefully they won't get in trouble all summer. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks. All right. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.